Hello, everyone. This is next episode of Enter the Matrix, but actually first episode of Road to WTC. Because for those of you who might not know, myself and Nathan here, Nathan Roberts, hi, we will be taking part in WTC as something that we never actually done before, which is being more of a media people. So we'll do some coverage. We'll be doing coverage live at the event. So you'll have people doing the streaming of the games, and us will be doing more of the media coverage of what's happening in the round, etc., in more a studio style. So like you have those Saturday, Sundays football uh, thing in UK, from what I recall. So basically, that's something that we're aiming for, and we will do some materials for those of you who might not be so familiar with the format. You might be just starting, or I don't know, you're the very fresh player who might be on the team but started playing competitively like 2 years ago and got onto the team, like Anthony in Team USA. So there will
Sure.
be some topics that we touch upon that come throughout the years and show not only the description of the event or like how the event works, but also like history of event, which will be the topic of today. So you want to add something, Nathan?
Yeah, so thanks for having us, guys. And it's always nice to be able to do things like this. Obviously, we're both kind of new to this, moving away from both playing and coaching roles into a more, unfortunately, this space is normally for radio, but it'll be, unfortunately, on your podcasts and streaming services this time. But yeah, looking forward to it. And yeah, we'll crack on with the history of the WTC, or ETC as it used to be called, and let you know what that was all about.
So I think the event started in 2007, and what's I think interesting that's the idea of the event, from what I recall, didn't come from 40k people. It actually came from fantasy battle teams,
Hmm.
and it was one of the fantasy battle players from Gorzów in Poland back then who said that, well, we
Okay.
have like those forums online that sometimes somebody will post something, maybe let's try and organize some people. So basically there was like a not so big group of players
Hmm.
amongst the teams that just figured out that they want to try and play against each other, so they decided to create an event. Back then they called it ETC, so European Team Championship, and it took place in Gorzów, which, by the way, you were in Gorzów as well, but 5 years later,
Hmm.
Nathan. And that's basically the very beginning of it, as
Right,
the
I didn't know that.
fantasy battle just initiated it, and then it suddenly happened that 40k also joined. Probably someone who was involved back then, like I don't know, in our team it was Vladi and Skark. They might still know those old days, but
Hmm.
yeah, we had people who just joined the game, and at that point it was very small. We had 10 teams,
Yeah.
and it was Germany, Poland, England, France, Italy, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, and United Nations, which back then was named Team Europe, which, funnily enough, Team Europe took fourth place.
Yeah.
And Team Europe actually back then had Skark as a mercenary.
Oh, really?
Back
Right.
then, Skark wasn't actually in the team. He wasn't good enough. So it's like way back. We
Hmm.
haven't played back then. I mean, I started playing, but I wasn't playing competitively. Yourself?
Uh, yeah, I had started by then doing tournaments, but with, um, I wasn't involved in the WTC or the ETC yet. That wasn't until a few years later. But yeah, actually, I didn't know that was from fantasy based. I know kind of fantasy at that point because I was actually playing that kind of time a lot more fantasy than 40k because it was arguably it was a better game in some ways, and actually the tournament scene was almost bigger in some cases than 40k. But that's obviously flipped since changes to the game. But no,
Like IP and not having the game at all might also impact shit.
yeah, that might do something. Yeah, I know the England team that did go in 2007 had Gaz Jones. He's on the
Mhm.
Welsh team now. I believe he was on there, and gaming team that I used to be a part of called Flame On. They had a few members on that team as well. So I remember them going out for that, being like, let's just have a fun time. And obviously they came ninth and didn't do so well. But it was all new and fun back then.
Yeah, I think it was back then. It was more of an idea of just meeting people from other nations, not as competitive as nowadays. Which I can also see when I look back at like old Polish forums where you could actually see some of the conversations. Like there was nowhere near the level of preparation. You would just bring your best players and just have fun. And I think it translated to the very next year. If you look back in 2008, I don't know where was it. It was in München. You were in Monachium, right?
So 2007, yeah, I think you said it was Poland. I've got a feeling 2008 was Italy, and then it was 2 years in Munster in Germany.
Yeah. Then Munster, then Switzerland.
Yes, and then there's Montreux.
Yeah.
Which was,
2008 was Italy, and histories of very cheap wine.
Unfortunately, I missed that
one. Back then this event wasn't as serious. I think we could start to see one of the biggest rivalries in the whole WTC come up back then, because when you look at 2007, Germany won the event and Poland came second, and back then Poland drew Germany from what I recall, so we ended up second by the differentials, and next year I think we beat Germany, so we ended up winning the event, and both those years Sweden came third. So there's like a history of Poland and Germany. Basically, whoever won that matchup won the event. And I recall, I think in 2009, I think Polish team had, because they haven't lost in 2 years. I'm not sure if it was 2009 or 2010. You might know if it was 2010. They had like the undefeated shirts.
Yes, they did. Yeah, I do remember.
It was 2010.
Actually. Yeah, I think that might have been the. Did they lose in 2010?
I think it might have been 2010. So I'll get to that in a second. So like 2009, that year Sweden won. I think it was a story of. I don't remember the games themselves. I think if you ask some older people from the Swedish team or Neil Kerr, they might know. I wasn't present back then, so I don't know much. But it was another year that I know Poland didn't lose a game. They just lost on tiebreakers or drew against Sweden. I don't recall what. And that year was like a first year where you actually saw development of more teams coming in. And I think it might be because more people got aware of the event. We saw 16 teams this time, with like Northern Ireland coming over and England still not performing the best back then. And there was like that clear competition still between Sweden, Poland, Germany, and you could see it for years to come. But maybe about 2010, you can give more input from your point of view as you were there.
Yes, so from 2010 onwards is like, when you see like 2010 onwards, you start getting over 20 teams. 2010 had 24 teams. It's obviously grown from 2009. So I was actually playing for Scotland for my first 2 years because I wasn't good enough to get on the England team, despite my brother being the captain. But it was always a case of I really enjoyed my time at Scotland because it was more laid back, and obviously Neil Kerr was our captain at the time, so obviously I've been those few years. But yeah, I think 2010 onwards is really where it was noticeable that particular teams were starting to treat it more like a sport, where you had to do a lot of prep. You had to be more careful with what you were doing on the evenings. Everyone out not all teams were going out getting absolutely smashed. Some teams, that was their prerogative. Scotland, that was our prerogative.
Those were times where Neil had long hair.
think he was losing it by this point. But yeah, he had longer hair, yeah. Not the bold, stunning man that he is now. But yeah, 2010 Munster was definitely... Obviously, we had 2007, 8, 9, where you had, Germany win it, then Poland win it, then Sweden win it. And then it was like from 10 onwards was that basically round turntable of Sweden, Poland, Germany were always going to be... You'd always have a weird one where Poland might beat Germany, Germany would beat somebody else, and then Sweden would beat Germany. So it was always kind of like that little round table of you'd have like you almost had 3 teams on 5 wins out of 6.
I think it was till 2014 that not a single team got 6 wins out of 6 games.
Yes, yeah.
It was only in 2014. It was the first year that team won all of their games, and it's also worth mentioning that like the very first years it was only Saturday Sunday event.
Yes, it was only a 2-day event.
Yeah, so it was 5 rounds then? Do I recall it correctly?
It might have still been 6, but the game lengths are only like a regular tournament game was 2.5 hours. You had 3 hours with pairings, whereas now we're looking at more 4.5 hour games with pairings because you've also got to set the table up, and it's a little bit of a longer game now. And by that point, I think 2010 was the first time we played 1,750 points. And then at some point, it increases to 1,850 points until we get to the later stages where it's 2,000 points. But no, like Munster was an interesting one where you had the first time where it felt like it was a really huge event. You had 40 odd nations for Warhammer Fantasy. You had 26 teams or 24 teams for 40k. It's later on that they started introducing other games as well. But,
and it felt like actually a holiday, but maybe holiday is a bad word. Like you could actually see all the nations and all the systems going together. And I recall it. Obviously, my first year I was playing was in 2012. I wasn't in the team back then. I was in Mercs. But I remember like that feeling of actually going to the Polish team in other systems and talking to them and like being happy and like trying to cheer each other on, grabbing a smoke, going outside and talking to them. Like you actually felt like you were a nation that was playing few games.
Yeah. One of the nice things about Munster was they were also, because it was in like I think it was a ice rink. They lots of teams obviously went to hotels, but actually what they allowed you to do was sleep in the venue. So if you brought camping equipment and everything else, so I think quite a few teams, half the people on those teams would stay in the actual venue. So you had everybody mixing all the way through the day and all the way through the night. I know some.
It was like a big party for some teams, and there were like those teams that you would look at top 5. Those teams being a little bit more serious.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
So 2011, that was Switzerland, and from what I recall, I only know stories that I was told by the elders in our community about sleeping in like nuclear fallout bunkers, etc., as a hotel where you had bunk beds. So what's your experience?
It was simultaneously one of the most beautiful ETCs we've been to and the most expensive place I've ever been to. And this is still, 12 years ago. And so like Gaz Jones, who was on the team, him and another teammate, they thought, rather than going to a restaurant, what we'll do, or like somewhere to grab lunch, we'll just go to the local market because they had stalls and things. We'll get a baguette, some slices of ham, and that'll do, just like a cheap sandwich. And when they totted it all up, it ended up being like 25 francs, which is like 20 quid. Or, it's like 25 euros. And you're just like, oh, nothing here is cheap. So effectively, we stayed in a hostel in the arse end of nowhere. We had to walk to the venue every day because you could not get taxis. We basically ate at the same, like, you got chips and a kebab in a cup, and it was like 10 quid each time, but it was the only place you could afford to go. And we basically ate there every single evening. Drinking was just, you had to go to the cheap supermarket and find the little stubby bottles, because if you wanted to drink anything else, unless you brought it with you, you weren't doing it because it was horrifically expensive. But then every day you would walk along the walk along the lake looking at mountains with like Renaissance, Enlightenment period, I want to call them mansions, walking past all of them every morning, be like, oh, this is great. And then people are swimming in the lake. The Swiss must have thought we were cretins because we were just loads of like, you had Neil Kerr, and basically, let's be honest, the BMI of most war gamers is pretty horrific. So you just had these seals all swimming in the lake while we're all just making their views awful. But
I think that's the
yeah,
year that you also had the story of like fantasy battle player who had cocked dice that didn't have like a one, because back then when you had like anvil in dwarves, if you rolled a one, it would blow up. So he didn't have a one, so he rolled it all the time. And when somebody caught him doing that, he actually threw it into the lake, hoping that it would not resurface.
yeah.
So
I don't know many of instances of cheating, but it happens. There's so many people there.
I think at one point I only started playing in 2012, but I feel like at some points like the competition was too tense.
Yes.
Like there's a reason why now there's all the gentleman play, all the things that Neil wanted to introduce so much into the
Yes.
event, and that's
Yeah.
because at times it was unbearable. Like you knew that if you were facing like say Team Germany or us back then, that those games will not be fun.
Yes. Obviously England was on the fringe of that for a little bit of time, but it was a case of when you knew you were playing Germany or Poland, and it's not necessarily wrong that they were doing that because that unfortunately was the game back then, but it was, you couldn't give anybody anything. Like you had to,
No
and
takebacks.
and because you were part of a team, it was kind of a, if you make a mistake, I have to punish you because it's a team environment and I can't let my team down. There's a little bit of a, if there's something gamey I can do. I think 2010 was that year where some guy had white scars, full bike army. You could reserve your whole army at that time.
Yeah.
And it was, okay, this guy had Kroot and he infiltrated every single board edge on the first turn and basically went, your army can't come on the table.
There's memes about that. Like
Yeah.
you know those memes about the guy
Yeah.
sitting being really happy.
Yeah.
And yeah, those were the things. And that was a problem because back then it created a reputation for certain teams, and
Yes.
it really stuck for years to come, even when the teams got better. Like I know when I went for the first year in the team in 2013, I knew, like, everybody told me that I do not want to play neither Spain or Germany. Like those teams will not be fun at all. Not even one more for the lack of the communication actually, and all the communication issues. But the other was, I knew like it would be tough and it will be very gotcha, and you need to have like basically a list of all the stuff you do point by
Yes.
point, a checklist that you check whilst doing your turn.
Yes.
So it wasn't that fun. And one thing that we didn't mention is that in 2010 it was Poland winning. Second place was Germany. Then for a change in 2011 it was Germany winning, and Poland took second place. So you could see some patterns there.
Like we said, it started in 2007, but that eternal conflict, for a Diablo reference, kind of lasts for, is it 10 years?
Yeah, I think 2016 was the last year.
Yeah, where the dominance was completely broken. Yeah. Yeah, it was, and it was always, even from Fringe being on Team Scotland or being a part of Team England, it was always a case of the round that you always looked out for was Germany versus Poland. Whoever won that or drew that usually went on to win. It was kind of if they then beat a Sweden, or it then became like a
If
Spain,
we didn't fail against the team that we would play the very next round. And I think 2012 also was the very first year we had 3-day event. We had 2 games on Friday, 2 games on Saturday, and 2 games on Sunday. I'm pretty sure that was a thing because I was a mercenary in 2012, and I remember one of our players who was in the Polish team in 2011 didn't show up on Friday because he was convinced that we start on Saturday. So I'm pretty sure 2012 was the first 3-dayer that we had.
Why do I think that WTC is the only time it's been 3 days? I thought it's always been 2 days.
No, it's been 3 days since I've been playing.
It was 3 days. Sorry.
Playing, it was 3 days. Previously, it wasn't. So it's also
it's the number of games that's changed. Sorry, it went to 7 games. Yeah, sorry, that's what changed. Yeah, it was over 3 days. Yeah,
it was 6 games till WTC. WTC changed it to 7.
Yeah, when you have over 30 teams, you realistic, because otherwise you could have teams on. You could have multiple teams on 5 wins, 1 loss, and you don't get a necessarily clear winner.
And that's usually how they even ended. When you look historically, you had one team who was clear-cut winner, and then places 2nd to 4th, 5th, usually were the teams with tie on wins, draws, loses. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. Maybe it was only 3, depended on the year, but it was decided by tiebreakers a lot of the times.
A lot of the time it was decided by tiebreakers, until about 2016 onwards, then it was a bit more clear-cut. The game became a little bit more clear-cut with the rules. But it was a little bit we knew that if England was we could come joint 3rd, but that would be 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th could all be on the same points. It was then just count back and penalties and other things that would just change it.
Yeah. And back then, the things that were done, how you posted lists, I think that one is also interesting. Back then, there was a specific forum that you would submit your lists on a given date. So you would need to submit it till midnight in Central Europe time. So you'd have teams that are on different time zones that would be stressed.
Yeah,
and
we always had 11.
And more than that, you had teams posting lists 2 hours before. So you would look into it and be maybe we missed something. And then you would change it. So, and everything would happen on forums. We wouldn't have any applications that you have nowadays. Tourney Keeper itself was created to facilitate the ETC.
Yeah.
That application was used, I think, first time in Croatia or 1 year
definitely
earlier.
Later on,
The pairings were posted on forums. You could get them on messages on Facebook, or there was actually a printout who's playing who, and you would have to go and see that printed out piece of paper to see who you are playing. So there would be always a crowd by that pillar. So it was interesting back then. We've come far.
I think it's around the 2012 mark where it used to just be the 8 players. That was kind of it. Every team, there was only 8 players, so that's all you took. And then it started becoming, everyone takes a coach. And then it came a little bit at that point where it wasn't all online and everything else. It was kind of you took a coach, and then I don't want to call them a spy, but they were effectively go wander around and see what they're doing for pairs.
There's a reason why this year it was forbidden for coaches to look over the pairings.
Yes.
Because that was a thing that was happening.
100%.
And that was a role of coaches to see how certain teams pair, because nowadays if you see like pairings on BCP, you can kind of figure it out. Like you don't have the pairings themselves, but yeah, like you can get a vague idea if you have a conversation with them, they might say, or how you write down who's playing who. Like there might be a pattern with how you write from the first defender to the last, etc.
And if you know which table's the light terrain, which one's the heavy terrain, you can sometimes vaguely work out.
This is also another thing, terrain. Oh boy, that one was rough, because first year that we actually had terrain maps was 2018, right? Croatia? I think Croatia was. Before, it was like literally a roulette what you get.
Yeah, like our change, when we played in Poland for Team England in 2012, we were like, oh, the terrain's super heavy. This has favored our armies. This is fantastic. 2013, we're like, oh, the terrain will be something similar. It'll be really heavy. We took heavy terrain oriented lists, got there, and it was like playing on pool tables. And our lists got smushed. So at that point, finding out what the terrain was half the ETC.
And the same was for us in 2016. Or no, I think it was actually 18, our worst score ever. It was, we expected another year of empty boards after Salamanca, and it turned out that was the very first year ISIC actually took part in the preparation, and the boards were insanely dense in 2018.
Yeah,
like beyond what we have seen in previous editions. And like those things, I'm glad we have terrain packs nowadays, because it is competitive. Beforehand, it was just a roulette whether you hit with your army ideas, etc., or not. And also, I think another thing to mention about the pairings themselves. I think 2015 was the first year we had 2 attackers into 1 defender.
Yes. Yeah.
Beforehand, the pairings themselves worked in a way that before the pairing started, you chose one of your armies, put it aside, and that was your champion.
Yes.
Nobody knew the opposing team's champion, and the remaining armies were you proceeded with the pairings as usual, but with the tweak that only one attacker is assigned to a defender. So back then, you needed really good defender lists to take on everything, and they were much more of a throwaway than nowadays, or they needed a board. When you look back, you had like a defender, say, leaf blower guard back in 5th. If they took empty board, it might not have mattered what you are playing against.
No.
So it was a big change, and it was a great development. Although I like the idea of having a champion as an army, like as an unknown.
I actually kind of, I know I like the system we have now, but maybe because I'm old or whatever, I think I actually prefer you put one and they put what plays against you, because I think that actually develops a lot more. You actually have to design a proper put forward list that can play anything, which is hard to do now. And so maybe the game has gone, the damage output. Like if you brought a 5th edition now into 10th edition, 5th edition list now into 10th edition, you'd get tabled in turn. I don't know what we used to be like. Oh, I've got 5 las cannon razorbacks. I'm like, cool. Now,
or like Hydras being the most obscene shooting in the game back then, which had 4 autocannon shots.
Exactly. That's what was competitive. But I quite liked the fact that you had to build a full put forward army that could play 8. Whereas now you have a little bit more of a put forward list almost has way more power than it used to, because I get to go first put forward, I'll pick the least worst of those 2, and I get to pick a board. So it's kind of, actually, you are seeing now where your put forward list, I know we'll probably go into depth in this more later, your put forwards are actually more of a commanding position to gain points now. Whereas before, you had a put forward player who would happily sit in a corner, get what he has to play put against him, and then he'd be like, guys, I got 3 points. You're like, oh, yes, get in.
Yeah, I think where the idea of the first defender bringing more points and being like the sacrificial goat was glorified, because back then it was really nasty role. Like
Yes.
you're supposed to get smashed, and
And you
back
had
then
to have the right player.
and you had like players who would score out of 120 points back then. They would score what, 19, 27.
You were like, oh, if
Just-
our first put forward brought back more than 25 points, you'd be like, that guy did really well.
Yeah, it was rough.
Yeah. Unless you 20-0'd somebody or got 15 or
Mismatch.
something in a first round smash, then yeah, you were pretty much like against top teams. You're like, if I can bring 3 to 5 points back, I've done my job.
Yeah, that's why I recall like 2014 being our really great year, because that was previous pairing for Polish team, and we had Skark as first defender who scored 104 points out of 120 as first defender, taking anything that opponents brought. And that was like something you wouldn't expect. Like very specialized attacker lists would bring above 100 points.
Yes.
Like it was really hard to even bring above 100 points as a player. Like it wasn't easy, and because the system was so much different back then. Even before cards, I mean, fifth, where you counted killed points, etc., which is also another thing. Like your score depended on how many points of actual models you killed. So if you played very conservatively and you didn't give out units, your opponent really needed to push you sometimes to get those points, because markers at the end of the game also counted as points. And another thing that we do not have anymore, there was also random game length, which impacted, like it could flip a whole round by its own.
Yeah.
Which I'm glad it's gone.
The other scoring from, say, fifth and backwards was there was an mission objective. If you drew the objective, you both got 10, and then it was plus or minus the VP differential. If you won, you got 15 points, plus or minus the VP differential. If you lost, you got 5 points, plus or minus the VP differential. So you could lose the game, but I smashed you, I got 9 points. I could win the game, but actually you killed loads more of my army, I only got 12 points. Or it was that kind of... So we've had with every edition change, the scoring system has changed massively as well.
Yeah, and it changed a lot how the games were played. And I found it very refreshing, I would say. That every year you kind of needed to play, but I had some of my favorites and not. But going back, I think 2013, I remember 2012 as a year that the organization was dodgy, to say the least. And I think that was a big problem for upcoming ETCs, because as that year was dodgy, next year is when you had like a bid for an organizer, because you actually had people who would be like put forward bids, and then you would have people voting which country should host. Then you would have nations that essentially people would look for cheaper countries. I think that's why we had Serbia twice, because compared to Switzerland, well, that's a difference.
Yes, and Switzerland was a problem for other reasons, because it was difficult for some teams to get visas as well, because obviously it's not technically in the EU. Poland had a few issues where in 2012, because it was the first one that was a bit more expensive than the others, and then we got there and it was like, actually there's no food provided, you had to buy your food on top, and people were like, well, that wasn't in the bid, that wasn't quite where we thought it was going to be.
And we were also playing like inflatable.
It was outside in a tent.
Yeah, and like inflatable big tent. And if you're unlucky, you would play by that air conditioning, and you would actually have problems with keeping your models straight.
Yep, and the terrain was made out of foam, so the terrain would just go.
Fly away.
Yeah.
So,
but you wanted to be by the fan, because if you were stood in the middle of the hall where the fans didn't touch you, it was about 35 degrees Celsius.
Not great.
No, it was not good. Some 2 people had heat exposure.
Yeah.
And then Fantasy was played inside the sports hall that had tiny windows on it, so they were all in 35-degree heat. So they
Boiling.
weren't much better. Yeah. So people were like, oh, okay. This. So had England not won it in 2012, it would have been by far the worst ETC we'd ever been to for me personally.
Yeah.
But that overshadowed everything.
Yeah. And then what? 2013, it was first year in Serbia, and I think that's the reason we had 3 times Serbia over the years.
Yeah.
It's because the organization was good. Like you didn't feel scammed, maybe except by the food you got.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't want to buy the food. You had that good pleskavica on the other side of the road. That was the way to go.
Sure.
But it was real cheap. And I think that was a main selling point. I remember myself being back then, like 17-year-old, feeling like I actually had money as a high school student in that country, which was real nice. And actually, like, I remember even the aircon worked. Like, it was in general well organized, a lot of space, like really a lot of space, which was a nice change.
Like, I think it was the first year that you had access around the entire table. Because in previous years you were bunched next to each other, so it was really claustrophobic before.
It's also worth mentioning that, like, in previous editions there was no hammer and anvil deployment, so there were no short edge deployment, so there wasn't really that much of a necessity to actually have that space on the sides of the table, except for the player's comfort. But then it was prioritized way more, which also meant that you needed bigger halls, bigger venues, which also meant bigger prices usually. So you could see a huge spike in prices over the years as well.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, Serbia, the few years we had in Serbia, have definitely been the best run. Okay, excluding the WTC last year, actually, I think the WTC last year was the best run of 40k events we've had since it started, personally. But Serbia was, like you say, nice weather, excellent food, excellent restaurants, everything's cheap, it's not difficult to get to, everyone could get there, no visa issues or anything. So yeah, Serbia ticked all the boxes, which is why, because it was going to be 2 years, and then was it France who won the bid, but their stadium collapsed, so we had a third year in Serbia, was it?
No. We had 2 years in Serbia, then we had Prague.
Yeah, then we went back later.
Then we had Athens, Salamanca, Croatia, and then Serbia in 2019. Yeah. So you guys won both times in Serbia.
Yes.
No, once in Serbia, once in Poland.
Yeah. But we came third in Serbia as well, the first year.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
Good place for
us. I think you could also see that from like 2013, 14 onwards, we started to have more teams, not necessarily only you would call from European sphere. Like I think, what was it, 2010 that you had first USA team, but then we started having more teams, not even maybe traveling there, but trying to get there. And it would take time till we had like Canada coming over or Australia. It needed the game to become way more popular, and like the event and the whole media making it more accessible. Because what's also important, I think, when you look back to like those events in 2004, like I think till 2016, there wasn't really that much information shared between the communities. There were like, you had your small forums, you had your small tournaments happening, God knows where, made on piece of paper, made like literally pairings done on piece of paper, and you'd fill in Excel sheets.
Yeah.
If you were in a lucky country, you had your software. Like in our case, like one guy did it as his uni project, and we had like whole software for providing tournaments. And now to this day, he sometimes supports it. But you wouldn't get those information that you can get now from like BCP, Gunhammer, etc. Every country had their own metas, something that was very specific to their country. And I remember even us as Polish team traveling, say, to Germany, like we would actually take like dumb lists and go for a team event in Germany to figure out what they would play.
Sure.
That was just and you guys coming over to like Polish team championship,
That's
which
what
was
we
like
did.
2 months before the ETC. Like that was also a thing. Like France, Russia, you guys coming over to our team tournaments as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that was that year. I think the 2012 build up. We won our own home nations because we do an event every year: England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. Later on, we've added Belgium. Later on, we added 2 other guest nations as well. We went to the Polish team champions, and I think we won it in 2012 as well. And I was on that team. And then we went to the ETC as well, where we won that as well, which was, other than Sweden winning it before, other than Sweden winning it 2 years previous, like not 2 years, 3 years.
3 years.
It was the 2 little blips in the Germany-Poland conflict of first place. Like there's just those 2 little standouts, and that's about it.
Yeah, from 2007 to 2016, it was what? Poland winning 3 times, Germany winning 5 times, and once Sweden, once England.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why when you look at like the summary and people talking like Poland was the most winningest nation, I want to add there's actually like small asterisk to all of it. All those information are actually related to like our average placing, which was better because we didn't have those bad years like say England had before. And also we didn't have those years where Germany like decided we do not want to be those bad guys that no one wants to play. So we decided to switch the whole team, take new players, and everyone to know that we are the good guys nowadays, and none of the old guard is playing. And that's a change that I think whenever you see those aggregated information, you see Poland at the top because our worst year was like 6th. And it was 6 out of 30 teams, not like 9th out of 10 teams. So it changes averages a lot. And I would say over the years, the most wins as a nation, it was Germany. Then it was us, and then I think it was you guys Sweden. Have 2. No, Sweden won once. You guys have 2 over the years.
Yes, of actual podium finishes. Yeah, it's
no. I meant like winning. Yeah, I mean podiums probably it would still be Germany, Poland, and then Sweden somewhere because they got.
We've got 2 golds and a bronze. Sweden have got a gold, a bronze, and a silver. They got another podium? Don't remember.
Yeah. You could check it. Yeah. If for anyone listening, you can check it out on WTC webpage. They have history tab where you can actually look it up and see what was the history. And I think 2017, which was the glorious year of Storm Ravens and Brimstones, in Salamanca in scorching heat, like that one was rough. And also organization wise it wasn't the best, I would say. You had those I remember like terrains, like you would actually have like giant Homer Simpson on the middle of the board.
Horrific,
as a terrain piece.
Was it Salamanca or Athens where we had that hour and a half delay because the software crashed because everyone was looking at the page?
Yeah, I don't. Maybe it was Salamanca. I know.
One of them.
Athens in 2016 was the year that Neil said, "Fuck it, I'm taking over. Like this is too much." And this Athens was a year that it was real bad. They had like no staff. Neil basically made the tournament run, including like changing toilet paper, which it was real bad, and he needed to take a break, which I think is totally fair. But there's a reason why, for those unaware, like Neil is considered like a saint of this community. If you talk shit about him, probably someone in that room will slap you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
He's the godfather of at least the 40k side. Definitely, he's the godfather of 40k ETC WTC, because without
or like
him, it wouldn't be where it
gentleman
is.
play.
Yes,
And
that's
gentleman play.
Yeah.
Forcing people to not be cunts.
Yeah.
Because
Like,
that was a big problem.
Granted, we missed 2 years because of COVID, but that's only come in the last 5 years. What, 2018, 19 onwards?
I think Salamanca as well was already like
Yeah.
more chill when I recall the games. Like it was, there
Yes,
weren't many problems.
I felt maybe that was the case because we just swapped to 8th edition last minute, and it was the index editions where everyone's just like, this game
And
is
it was
awful.
dumb.
So everyone's just like, let's not go too crazy. But wasn't that also the year where people were complaining about? Oh no, that's 7th edition. Sorry, ignore me. There was I think the fair play thing started with I can't remember which two nations. I think it was Germany and somebody else, where somebody brought flyers on, didn't declare that they were shooting ground targets, so his opponent said you can now have to roll on 6s. And then it was kind of a case of, well, that's not sportsmanship because obviously he's only going to shoot ground stuff. German player then brings on his flyers, does the exact same thing, forgets to declare, and his opponent says, well, no, you can't do that. And then they have refs over, and the ref's like, well, are you going to allow him to do that? Otherwise, you're going to give you a yellow card. And he's like, yeah, he did that to me, so yellow card. This is like, okay, yeah, this needs to change because this whole, especially like when it started getting really competitive, 2010 to 2015, those years where it's really important who wins. It definitely had a bad reputation.
Like and also, it's worth mentioning that compared to ITC, there were no prizes.
Oh, like, nothing.
I can show you some of the trophies I have. Those are not really glorious. I have them more as like mementos, but
yeah,
those are not stuff not like last year's trophies. They weren't great, and you played for nothing but the glory and feeling better than other nations.
Yes. Oh yeah, like my 2 ETC trophies are awful. Like it's one thing that I know some teams have done it before, but it's one thing that we've lobbied when we swapped to the WTC from the ETC. It was always a case of, can we finally have good trophies? Because we all spend, especially if you're like in Australia or USA or even Iceland, let alone getting here. If you're Australia, unless you're buying knockoffs, the actual cost of Warhammer is horrifically high. Getting over here is going to cost, it's going to cost 1,000, 2,000 euros, whatever you want to call it. It's going to cost an absolute fortune to get over here. And
I think it's at least 2,000 euros for a round trip.
Exactly, yeah. Especially with the flights being what they are now, cost-wise. But yeah, it's like, can we actually have some decent trophies? Because yeah, of my entire trophy cabinet, it's like, I've got these 2 little ones in the corner, which are the most prestigious, but then like they're the worst ones in here by far.
I think I have mine just by myself. So those, I think this is what?
Bronze, maybe?
2013 bronze. 2015 bronze. At least it says so. And those aren't like, those weren't great.
No, they're not.
So yeah, there was way too much competition, and I think nowadays the competition is healthy.
Yes,
like,
much better.
At least people accepted the fact that if you were to win, it's better if you win fair and square, not because of being a dick to your opponent. And I think that was actually like how Neil advocated the rule that don't be a dick. That was just the referee rule.
Yeah,
just don't be a dick, man. That's all.
100%. It got a little bit more difficult. We can discuss it later or something, but it got a little bit more difficult when clocks came in, because clocks are one of the biggest. Because time management has always been a problem at WTC. From us, I know England has a weird relationship with the rest of Europe, but it was always a case of we'd always feel like, 3 hours is plenty of time for a game. And then for anybody who's new, he's like, oh, 3 hours is fine. I'm like, wait till you play in the WTC or the ETC, because European time is different. Like, you'd have games that are 3 hours and you'd play, I'm not going to name a nation, but they'd get to 2 turns and be like, how do we get to 2 turns in 3.5 hour games? And that's where they implemented clocks. Clocks, while fantastic.
Like before clocks, there was a year where you actually written down start and end time of each turn on a piece of paper. That was nuts. So like it was actually stalling was a big problem, because unless you have a judge from the very beginning, you cannot tell necessarily who was stalling. You can at that point assign like a warning to the both players, and then watch for repeat offenses.
Yes, yeah.
But that's all you can do.
Like when we were talking about 5th edition, if you were put forward player and you're like, oh well, he can't 20-0 me if we only have 3 turns. Like there was almost, other than fair play, there was less. I'm not saying this happened very frequently. It was actually still very rare, thankfully. But it was a case that you'd have games that like, oh well, it ended up 13-7 because well we only got 3 turns.
Yeah, and and those games are stuck in your brain. Like if those games and those problems we mentioned were more common, we wouldn't be willing to participate in the event anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
But those were one-offs. But if you have even like one game like that every round, it's still 6 rounds of play, and you know more about it because one team got penalized in a way for the opposing team being unfair. So that was, clocks were a long conversation as well. Should we like split equally? Maybe if someone has more models, should it be unequal? It's like it was a whole layer of conversation where I think my main problem with clocks is that it removes part of the social interaction and puts more pressure on both players.
100%. Yeah.
I remember I remember when we played. Like we had a game where we didn't draw clocks. We were like, we're doing this. We're gonna finish the game. And I remember like turn 3. We both knew what's happening. It was dumb, but like early 8th edition. But we just had it like 10-15 minute conversation about life, and then went back to rolling dice.
Yes. That was my last ever ETC game, actually. And since then, I've been coaching. Yeah, it was my last. At least, granted, it was the worst ever edition
game.
Yeah, but it was at least the game ended well. At least I had a good game for my last game. But it was like that ETC was by far the worst, and we're going through it a little bit at the moment, being the last minute switch to change.
I think it's better than that time because you can see
100%.
We learned about it, like from our previous problems with switching editions. So like the organization crew knew what it will probably entail, and teams also knew. And we see that GW is already like, we probably will have like emergency patch within the next few days. So hopefully, fingers crossed. But yeah, it's gonna be better. I think it's also gonna be better because nowadays you will like the game is healthier to an extent that it might sound weird to people not listening to this for the first time, but I think like GW at times even realize some mechanics are broken. Like for example, flyers nowadays aren't that good, and back then they were very bad for the game and enjoyment.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony Chu, for your 9 flyer Elder Army.
Great fun.
Yeah.
Fun and interactive, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So, yeah, you were saying?
No.
And I think when we like go back to those years, I think there are like few things worth mentioning that were also first offs. Like 2014, as I mentioned, was the first year a team won all of their games. And it was Team Poland back then. 2015, it was Germany that they won all 6 of their games. And in 2016, they again won all 6 of their games. making them the only nation to actually win all 12. And from what I recall, both those years
Back-to-back.
also, I think both of those years also Death Rat won singles. If I'm not
Yeah.
if I'm not wrong, but I'm quite positive about that one. So
Yeah,
like those 2 years, it was like Germany is here to win. Like, and it wasn't even fun. I remember us playing them in both times we played them in 2015 and 2016. There was only one or two tables on our end on our end that won their games. So it wasn't even close.
Yeah,
So
we played them in Athens, and we had one kind of controversial game where it ended too early before, because a little bit nowadays you score way more throughout the game. In a lot of previous editions, you scored everything at the end.
yeah,
So you were trying to like hide and snipe and try and kill some stuff, and have going last was actually enormous in most games, unless you could just block the objective from people getting onto it if you had enough stuff. So then we had a couple of games in our round where the game ended early, so our better scoring at the end games were not doing so well. But I think I still think it wasn't that close, to be honest. Yeah, Germany, those 2 years were pretty horrific.
yeah, and I think 2017 they still had like the old guard. It just didn't work as well for them. And I think it was 2019 where they decided to swap most of their team,
Yes,
if I'm correct,
we
and
played
that's
them
where
that,
you have like bigger drop off, because in 2018 they were again fourth, so nothing bad, right? And and over the years, like you saw in 2017, Russia winning, which I think was a year where it was a tiebreaker for first and also tiebreaker for third. I think we had tiebreaker, but I'm not really sure about it. Then 2018, it was USA, I think, also winning all 6 of their games.
Yes.
And I remember US being themselves, boasting on Facebook that it is the first time somebody won all 6 when it was actually fourth. But good job, US, tooting
Yes.
your own horn.
And I know there's a little bit of a hashtag at the moment saying anybody but England, from what the previous episode was. But yeah, Americans forgetting history is an interesting one. That's usually pretty common.
I mean, theirs is so short that they might not remember. There's nothing to remember there. Yeah, and then in 2000 England, it was you guys winning again, with one American, and I think that's another turning point in the history of WTC, and that was how we joke in Poland, Sir Nicolas Nanowatowski, playing as a royal member of the English team, winning back-to-back the ETCs back then, once in USA, then in England. And I think it was a start of no mercenary approach.
Well, it's no mercenaries depending on how good you are, which I have my own opinions on that. We don't have to go into that controversial subject. I'm under the impression that if you want to say no mercenaries, that's absolutely fine. I totally get that. You are meant to be representing your country, but then I think that has to be across the board. I think if you can't take 8 players, that unfortunately your team just doesn't go. But that's obviously my own personal opinion. Because when you have a team that has 4 nationals and then 4 mercenaries, did you really take a team? It's not. To me, that's not in the spirit of we're doing nation versus nation. We're doing because if you're a lower team who's allowed to take 4 mercenaries, but then a higher team has somebody drop out, they can't take a mercenary. Maybe that would be allowed because it's last minute. But we basically took Nick because he wasn't involved in the American team anymore. He was friends with a lot of us, obviously native speakers. There's a connection between the USA and the UK. We all got on with him really, really well. We had a few issues with some of our potential selections. So for us, it was more of a case of we're not going to take certain people because we don't want to risk any issues with those selections. So then it becomes Nick's available. We all get on with him. We all really like him. We took one mercenary, but obviously it became a whole thing of, oh, you've made a super team because we took one person. But each their own.
Yeah, and I think that was a year also that we had first time Australia really trying.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. We played them last round and they were really good.
Yeah, and that's why they might have been a sleeper for 2022 as well, because when you look at the history, they only surfaced once and not really for everyone, because fourth place is just enough for people to ignore you at times if it was only once.
Yeah.
And there is also another asterisk for that year that USA performed poorly for compared to 2018, but they had last minute, well, dropout is a bad word, but they didn't have one player come. So that's like another asterisk for like last years of competition. But I think what actually was solidified in the last few years, when you look at it, is that Poland and Germany still are forces to be reckoned with. I find that both us and Germany are no longer a team that you look at thinking like they are either of them is going to win. I find us more as like a how do you say it? Gatekeeper, like a team that wins against us can win the event, but like we are the team that you have to beat if you want to win the event. We will usually fumble at one step.
Yeah, basically the 2 years England have won it, both those times we had to beat Poland. Every other time we've lost to Poland, we didn't do well because we played Poland quite a few times.
And I think we lost. That's a thing when you, I think, look both at us, like as Poland and Germany, like we have a history track of really good results that might not really translate nowadays, because back then, like back those previous years, we had years of experience. We had nation circuits that were meant to like cultivate newer players to get into the format to play more WTC style. And now that it's becoming more and more popular, and I'm really happy that it is, because I think Teams 40K is way better than singles, because
100%.
You can play bad armies, you can enjoy it, you can get that pesky first defender role with a subpar army and still perform to what your team needs. And those were the things that back then it was mainly Poland and Germany knowing most of it. And nowadays, I feel like more teams are actually aware of it and put the same amount of prep. And I think nowadays it's a lot more prep than what it used to be. When I look back like to 2014 when we won, I recall like having 3 weekends with the team. Like we would play, sit at friend's house, we would have 3 tables set up, and we would meet up and just play a lot of games to see what's happening, to identify strong armies, what's going on. But there was no TTS, there was no way to improve yourselves, there was no media outlets to actually get information from around the world, there was no way to get actual statistics of how armies perform or what armies are performing on like bigger stage. So I think teams are catching up and they realize that this is as much of a player game, but as much also as an information game nowadays.
Like we had a similar experience in 2012. It was the build up to it was we need to learn what everyone else has taken. So we went to 2 international tournaments, including Poland's. It then became a case of we had, I think, the 6 weekends leading up to the ETC, the whole team pretty much met. So everyone's traveling from around the country. You had every weekend doing that. When we were at the event, while we were playing the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Sunday evening was different, but there was no drinking. It was pairings matrices all evening on laptops, whole team conversations. Basically, shut all the fun down. If you want to win, you've got to do something about it. 2019 for us was a bit different. That was a little bit more of a we thought we were on top of it, but then it was still like the game is still a little bit random enough with Maelstrom cards and everything else to be like, we think we are in a good place to win, but it's way less predictable than it had been in previous years.
Reliable, let's say.
Yeah, like we could easily go into rounds being like, this should be in our favor, but actually if 3 of our players get crap Maelstrom cards, or
nothing you can do,
they stack objectives and win the side,
or the random game length goes,
all that. Yes,
yeah.
The variability of those games was harder to predict for sure, and also the I don't know if we've discussed it yet, how you did in 2019. Like, I think we had a round where we had 6 20s and 2 zeros. The 20 nilling somebody wasn't, if anybody doesn't know, we don't do it as I win 84, 83, I win the game. It's done on 5 wins, you win the tournament. It was, everything's done on a 0 to 20 sliding scale. So back then, unlike it is now, getting 20 nils was, if the game just started going past you, you were probably going to start getting potentially 20 nilled. If they start getting,
especially at one point, we were also playing a ruling that if you get tabled, you lose 20-0. Nevertheless, what were the actual scores? Like, you might be holding points for your team, so it's like turn 5 you get 8, turn 6 you get 7, turn 7 you get 0.
Yes,
because you just died.
You just got tabled, yeah, because you went for the objectives to get the 6, and then it carried on, and then you got 0.
Yeah,
which I do think, if we're going back to 10th edition, for WTC, you have to have fully painted armies anyway. That 10 points you get for painted, please make that tabling somebody. Should be out of 90. Personally, that's my personal opinion. Should be out of 90 if you table somebody.
So when you look at the scores, you're like, oh, the other one got real bad.
Yeah, you got. It's also a nice indicator for like, oh, that person actually got tabled. But that's a personal preference.
Yeah. Do you have like any other, looking back at the years, do you have any other takeaways from how it changed? Like, we just talked about the formats, the rulings, the refereeing, having actual TTS and stuff that allows you to practice, but maybe there's something else that jumps to your mind.
So yeah, over the years, I guess the main changes have always been when we've had to deal with last minute edition changes. So going into 8th was a nightmare. We got a lot of stick for winning 2012 because 6th edition was out, but we played basically the very end of 5th edition because they felt it was too much to swap to an edition, but they've obviously changed their mind.
We learned it, and in 2014 we immediately swapped to 7th, and we're like, nope.
Yes, yeah. Then what else has changed over the year? Scoring systems have changed, pairings have changed, terrain has changed massively. The latest one being clocks. We unfortunately had a year where people weaponized clocks. That was always, and that's still probably not 100% dealt with. It's still.
It's really hard to deal with it in a game where you have action reaction, not like chess, where you do your action end of time. Like, it's
unless you have a ref at every table, which is just nowhere near feasible. You can't.
And the ref is handling the clock.
Yes, exactly. And then you have issues of you have some things where it's just like, oh, the clock's been done wrong, but the ref can only look at the table and what he can see. So it is what it is. Other than that, change-wise, it's nice that it's opening up and we are having, not that the Germany-Poland era wasn't, well, it's not gone. You guys came back last year pretty powerfully. It's that hopefully it's a bit more, you could maybe look at 5, 6, 8, maybe even 7 teams who could potentially win it with how potentially the scoring system is going to work this year. And especially when there's a brand new edition, there's a strong likelihood that some teams will miss something, or one team goes all one way, one team goes all another way. Australia always has a very different meta. I've always felt Poland and ours have kind of similar metas.
We usually ended up with like 6 out of 8 lists being nearly the same.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. But then Germany's meta is different. USA's meta is very different. The year Russia came second in 2019.
They won. And 17 they won. They had weird lists.
Weird lists. Like we had so we drew with Russia. Well, technically we drew with them. They lost to us. It's a thing. Had we not had Manny play two of their team members in the singles, we might not have realized what some of their armies did. And that ended up being like a big thing that we had that year, where it's like these lists on paper look totally weird and totally different until you play them and go, oh, that's what they do. And that's always been my favorite thing about the WTC. I always, at the end, especially now with BCP and everything else, you can go look at the lists. Like last year's, I loved the German NID list, which was the no high tyrant, all the other thing, harpies, loads of zones, spitting out spawn mines left, right, and center, did all mortals. I took it to the next 4 tournaments I went to because I'm like, I actually really like that list, and it was different.
Or you were playing the Chaos Knight list I took to Netherlands, right?
Exactly. You took that, and I had 3 events with it, and it was one of the best armies I've used in 9th edition. I loved it. I'm a little bit sad that they've lost all their trinkets now. But yeah, it's one of those armies. ETC has always bred interesting, different armies where you can have an army that goes...
An innovation. Like, it was always innovation because you had those clear-cut 4-5 lists nearly in every team.
Sure.
And it was a question where, like, those remaining lists are actually something completely different that somebody skipped. And it's always fun to then look back and realize, like, whoa, like GSC list by Eric last year. No one played GSC in the world.
Nobody. And then everybody played after that.
Yeah.
But it's one of those, again, like I was talking about, Australia's meta is always quite different. They had a slightly hoardier meta than most other teams. Even in previous editions, they would take kind of, when we played them in 2019 and last year, they kind of carried through that, they probably have a bit more of a model-based meta than some other teams, which had maybe a more elite meta, or some teams. I think England has always been kind of you end up taking just 8, the 2 years that we did really well, you end up just taking like 8 super strong lists and just be good players. Was always the thing. We've always tried to be clever, and sometimes that one clever list has always just backfired. And it just didn't work. So you've got to be very careful. Sometimes they don't always work the way you want them to do. You think, it's a super clever list on paper, and then you get there and it's actually didn't do what I wanted it to. Or other teams didn't take what you thought they were going to take. It's a little bit, like you discussed earlier, it's a little bit more... Information's a bit more open. I think this year with 10th, it's going to be a little bit more... The addition is with less options. It's a little bit more meat and potatoes. You might see a lot of teams taking pretty similar lists. Like in Salamanca, when it was swapped to 8th edition, most teams had
nearly the same amount of Storm Ravens as players.
It was probably worse, to be honest. I know our team, we had 3 Storm Raven lists. I think we had 13 Storm Ravens on our team. Just because the only list that we missed that year was Dark Talons, because one of our players said, that's crap. And we were all like, when we got there, because everyone else, all the other top teams took it, we were like, thanks. I'm not going to name who it is, but you know who you are, Alex. But
and like looking at the teams, I think in one of the next episodes we'll go into our predictions and like who we think are the contenders. Like right now, if I put you on the spot, what are the 5 teams you would look out for? Is it the classic Poland, Germany, Australia, England, USA, or do you have like someone else that pops into your brain?
So if I was doing it right now, you would have to say Australia, defending champs, should always be in the top 5. They should probably be podium again. They seem to be doing everything right. They have these proper boot camps, which is what you have to have. Maybe they're less necessary now with TTS, but I value face-to-face getting things done way more than TTS, personally. USA should always be favourites. They have I know maybe the team's changed a bit over the recent times, but they have more play testers than anybody. So if they've seen the edition months before other teams, they should always be a favourite.
NDA, the competitive advantage.
That too. I would like to throw England in there because if you look from 2012 onwards, we've come sixth a couple of times, but we're always a top 5. So I would predict we definitely come in the top 5 again. I think England has the best team we've taken in a while. And if we...
You do not have players that you question when you look at the squad. Question whether they should be.
I'd always,
at least from my side.
I'd question Alex Harrison, but...
Alex and Manny, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah. They're just difficult. But no, Germany and Poland are always going to be there based on history, based on last year's events. Who else would I put in there? Spain, we played them last round last year. They've got a couple of phenomenal players. They also, TTS, I think, has helped a lot of those, the Spain, Italy, those kind of countries really start. Canada's getting, they could end up being like in Australia a couple of years ago where they start breaking into top 5, maybe podium places. Outside of those like 5-6 nations, again, it's a new edition year. You could have, anybody could hit the mark.
I think we have like clear contenders for top 3, but I wouldn't be surprised if the list of teams that we could actually consider to get, like, for example, third place would be like 10 countries long. I think the competition is getting closer and closer throughout the years. You have more teams actually getting to that level over the years when they get enough exposure and experience. And I'm really looking forward to how I think the world is starting to appreciate the whole event and how much there it is about the event and how competitive it is.
Yeah.
I'm so looking forward to this year, especially that we'll be on the sidelines and we'll be able to shit talk all live. Yeah. Being coach or captain is the most stressful thing ever.
Oh, the thing I hated most about being, because I was coach for England last year, the worst thing was setting up the tables for everybody. They were all going doing pairings, and we had to bring 4 extra members just to set the tables up for everybody. And and then you're waiting on the stress of the rounds, and it's just the game.
You're more stressed as a coach than as a player.
Yeah, because I've got to go tell the captain, "Oh, look, we're getting battered," and he's just like, "I'll go tell him to push." And you're like, "Oh, okay, I'll do what I can." And they're like, "Hey, Mike, push." He's like, "No." It's
like, 9th edition. There's no such thing as push turn 3.
No, there wasn't, unfortunately. But then again, like, going back to the other thing, there's nations that are actually new this year who also, I think New Zealand will be a big one to look out for. They obviously have some good players. The meta might not be that different to Australia. I think they play with Australia sometimes. So again, that could be a big team that comes through and makes top 10 if they're on the ball, top 5. Other than that, I think it's going to be an interesting year, sure, certainly.
So on that note, thanks for everyone who was listening. There will be more episodes coming in. So for those interested, there's also Contact Lost they will be doing the coverage with us. They also do a series of interviews. They do interviews with captains. Myself and Nathan will be more on the like technical side because we're the old guys in the community that know what was happening. We've got all the stories. We've got all the dirty little things that we know people did. But if you're looking for more to learn more about certain teams, check out Contact Lost as well. They will be co-hosting with us. We'll be doing all the stuff at the event. And if you have any questions about the event or any topic that you would like us to touch upon, feel free to shoot on Discord, message me or Nathan privately, or even comment in the video, because we might be missing something. Like at this point, if you're so experienced, some of the things are obvious for us.
Yeah.
And we just treat them as something that was always there. But for someone new, especially if you're like first year, actually watching what's happening, what's the event about, we are the guys who can probably explain nearly any of it.
Yeah.
Everything.
Any questions, any stories you have if you've previously been, anything you want to know, scoring systems, whatever, just hit us up in the comments or on the Discord and just let us know what you want to talk about.
And see you in the next one. Thanks, Nathan, for joining in.
Thank you too, man. That was good.